Hi, Paola Jo from SederQuilts with a quick tip Tuesday for you. The question often comes across for new longarm quilters. So how big does the back fabric have to be? Can it be basically the same size as the quilt top? No. The answer on that is no. We're going to show you quickly why. The quilt top and the quilt back were originally exactly the same size. But Jackie's friend Carmen said, oh, we need to make it a little bit bigger. So they added 3-inch borders all the way around the back like a frame, which would work beautifully if you were tying the quilt. Or if you were going to be machine quilting on a domestic machine. Just adding a little bit more would be perfect because basically the quilt stays pretty flat the whole time that you are quilting it. But when we load a quilt back on a long arm frame and we wind things up and then you put the top on and the batting in there and you work on it, you keep winding it up. And we keep winding it up, and we keep winding it up, and we keep winding it up. And by the time you get to the end, there's been a lot of winding up here. It's kind of like a magazine. All the layers start out the same. But as you start to wind it up, and wind it up, and wind it up, pretty soon the layers are no longer equal. Now, granted, with a quilt, there's only 3 layers. There's the top, the batting, and there's the backing. But you need the backing to be bigger than the top because of the wind. The other reason you need to have the quilt back bigger than the quilt top is that you need a little bit of wiggle room. You need a little room from side to side in case the top doesn't stay real straight for some reason. You also need the top a little bit wider because, look at this. When we are stitching, one of the things we need to do is we need to make sure that things are stable. And we have side clamps. This base is going to run into the side clamp if you're too close. If I am stitched right up to the edge, I can't possibly stitch without bumping into the side clamp. Even if I'm a few inches away, I still might run into the side clamp if I'm starting off on the edge with a computerized edge-to-edge pattern. I'm going to run into that clip if it's too close. If I'm using rulers, and I have a ruler base on here, and now I'm going to look at how far I have to be away from the edge of this quilt base to not be hitting it. And if I have the clamp on here besides, which you have to have the clamps on there, oh my goodness, I need a lot of space to the edge of the quilt. So if I was going to be out here to the edge of the quilt, I need the back to be this much bigger on both sides. That's side to side, east to west. On the north and south ends, you need enough room so that you can get beyond all of the attachments. And you need enough space that you can get away from the bar and get it out there so that you can stitch on it. And I really like these leader grips. And these leader grips can be in the way, so you want them far enough away. So again, I want, 7 to 10 inches bigger in all directions around. That's what I prefer. But oftentimes they don't come that way, so I sometimes will add, here's the leader that comes on the machine, here's the leader that I add, and then here was the 3-inch leader that Jackie added. Yeah, you need the quilt back bigger than the quilt when you're using a long arm. It just makes life so much easier. Now, with that being said, I am a professional, and many of you are as well. And so I'm going to show you a couple other tricks. When you have a quilt back that is just barely big enough, there are a few tricks. We can puzzle this out. let me finish getting it off of here first. I have found lately that if I use, about a 4 or 5 inch piece of fabric, and I have this as long as my roller bars, if I add that to the belly bar side of the backing, and then if I attach a really nice wide piece of fabric to the back portion. So the back of this quilt is so pretty. It's beautifully pieced, and then there's a nice wide border around it. The back of this quilt is going to be just as pretty and functional as the front of the quilt. And because the back of the quilt and the front of the quilt were exactly the same size, they were 80 inches by 80 inches, both of them, Jackie put an extra 3.5 inches around all 4 sides to give me a little extra room so I could mount it on the long arm frame, which was very helpful. Unfortunately, 3 inches is not quite enough to accommodate being able to stitch with a ruler base or with a edge-to-edge computerized, or even just loading it on the machine. But if you were finishing this with a domestic, it would have been fine. And you could even roll that edge over and use it for the binding, and it would have been just lovely. It would have been fine. But yes, on a long arm, it's not big enough. So I was doing my very best constantly to make sure that side to side I was feeling where that seam was on the bottom, and I was basting along the edge, keeping it as close. Look at how close this was. I was trying to stay just barely in the ditch where that extra 3 inches was added on either side. And I did keep it centered east to west quite well. It's almost impossible to guess how much wind up you're going to have, the magazine winding up when you're trying to figure the top to the bottom. So I started just as close to the top as I possibly could and just barely overlap, the same as I was east to west on the sides. And then when I got down to the bottom, I was just praying. I was just praying that I had enough room. And I was very, very fortunate. I had about a 1/2 inch to spare before I got to the outer edge. So what we'll end up doing now is we're going to trim the quilt. I always trim my quilts unless people don't want them trimmed, but that way it's very easy to put the binding on. And so when I trim this, or if Jackie wants to do it herself, we're going to trim it just right about to the inside edge there. She's going to lose just a tad from the front. But yeah, she was saying, it seems such a waste to add all that extra for the backing when you're just going to cut it off. And yes, and you'll get all of that back. You'll have wonderful scraps for your stash. But oh my goodness, it is just very stressful to be a machine quilter and not have enough room to have the wiggle room in case things don't float and roll evenly and stay really super square. And then just never knowing how much you're going to gain or lose as you wind things up before you get to the bottom. So yeah, so please be nice to your long arm quilter and make sure that the back fabric is plenty big. Find out for sure how much she needs depending on her, whether she pins or whether she uses additional leaders or if she uses the leader grips. Most of us used to say 4 to 6 inches was enough, because we had a little bit on the sides. But so many of us use computers and ruler bases now that we really need more than that. So yeah, when in doubt, make the back too big. We can always cut off a little bit. We're going to send it all back to you anyway, and then you'll just have nice scraps. So for the next quilt back, if you need to add just a little more size to the backing, rather than adding an extra frame, an extra border all the way around, it would be much better to cut the back somewhere, not in the middle, but kind of a third or a quarter of the way in. Just make a slice and add a strip. Instead of adding 3 inches and 3 inches, an extra 6 inches in the middle would have solved the problem, because then this wide border would have been out just a little bit further, and there would have been, nobody would ever know how close to that edge we were. It would just spread everything out. That would work. Or if you're going to add just a border, to add the little border first and then add the wider border bigger than you need it. That way we don't end up with the seam where we have to cut it from the front to be right where that extra was added on. Where did it go again? Where is it? There's not very much of it on here. Oh, here. Because this just gets so bulky where that little bit extra was added on, and that's where we have to cut the quilt because we were so close. We were almost big enough. It just gets in the way and it's bulky, and well, now we got to trim some of it off. If that little bit extra had been added here instead, it still would have been the same final size, but where you cut off the extra wouldn't be in a seam, and that was really the issue. So anyway, if you have to make your back just a little bit bigger, slice it and add a piece in the middle, or add a narrow border before your wide border if you're gonna frame it up this way, and that would work even better. So I have trimmed the edges off of Jackie's quilt, and oh, it looks so pretty. The front has all these lovely stars and little tiny squares, and then the back has nice big squares, and it's really going to be lovely. She'll be able to put the binding on now, and in most areas the back looks gorgeous and the front looks gorgeous. She's ready to put the binding on, but in a few spots we do have a little bit of the extra showing from the back side. Oh, and that one is really good too. Okay, here. So I was staying as close as I could within the edges, but every once in a while there's a little bit of that extra outer border that is showing. And most of this, she'd actually be able to just take this off because the real backing comes right out another 1/4 inch here yet. And she could just take this little bit of excess out of here, if I can show it to you. The speckled is in between there. So she could just remove some of this excess. But the little bit further on down we go, pretty soon this one corner has about 1 inch of that extra border that shows. So again, there are options. She could trim 1 inch all the way around and keep everything square. So instead of 80 by 80, it's going to be 78 by 78. And that probably is the quickest, easiest way to handle this. Another good option would be to use much wider binding than usual. And she could put the binding on from the front, wrap it around to the back, and just make sure that it extends wide enough to cover up this little dab here. And that would be fine. She could even use a cute stitch on her domestic. I have little stars on mine, and so when I do a machine finish rather than a hand finish, I sometimes will do little stars or flowers or a little wiggle ditch, and it's quick and easy and fast to finish. And because there is this nice little edge in front, you'd have that little row of stars out in the front, and it would be really cute that way. So a wider binding, and she could keep it the 80 by 80, wrap that around and finish it. Or she could trim that little bit off. Or she could leave that little bit of scrappiness, happiness in the corner, and that would be okay too. It would bother some people though that are very concrete, sequential, and orderly and whatnot. But then there are some of us that, you know, sometimes things just aren't quite big enough and you have to add a little piece of something there. And that's okay too. So anyway, there are lots of options. So I trimmed it off nicely, square with the front. So the front is happy, and she can make her choices on all those options on how she wants to handle that little edge. So anyway, I'm gonna send the rest of the scraps home with her and mail it off, and oh, I can hardly wait for her to get it home and get the binding on. So anyway, hope this was very helpful. Thank you all so very much. Keep those questions and comments coming. Toodaloo.